better plug and abandonment procedures, well-designed and cementing, some of the Interior Department rules, and I just looked at these last night because they were issued while I was gone. They look pretty general, and we need to look at the specifics to know whether, and also the rules on paper are one thing, but how you implement and enforce them, as we now know, are everything. Better blowout response system. The industry is now designing what they're calling the marine well containment system. Well, where was that 10 years ago when they moved offshore into the deep water reservoir? At least they are building this now, but before they're allowed to go drill offshore in the deep water again, they need to have this thing designed, built, tested, and sitting on shore or on the rigs ready to go. We deserve that. I think the citizens of Gulf certainly deserve that. And of course, an oil spill response plan for worst case scenarios that does not include walruses and Japanese home shopping networks. These are BP's own recommendations from their report. Oh, yeah, it's probably the attention I should give them, but, and some of these are pretty good. There were about 25 recommendations in the list. You look at them and you also say, well, you should not have been doing these projects. We know they're high risk until you had all this sorted out. And notice, of course, they're talking a lot about contractor oversight. Again, they knew this 10 years ago, that this was a problem. Anyone that uses contractors know you've got to provide some legitimate oversight and audits of what they're doing. So what we know, this sounds trite, but we know oil, water, fish, and wildlife don't mix. And so that brings into the question, what is the role for science? You've got the natural resource damage assessment going forward to present a claim. I suspect that will not be used to present a claim. I suspect they will settle this thing like we recommended in Exxon Valdez. However, there is a legitimate need to monitor the injury from this and monitor the recovery or lack thereof for years in the future. At what level is the question? My personal opinion is we wasted a lot of money that was necessary, in the Exxon Valdez case, that was necessary for coastal protection and actual restoration. We wasted it on some pretty useless science projects that didn't tell us anything more than we knew in the first week of the spill. So, and this is it doesn't win me many friends in the scientific community to say that, but most of the work that was done hasn't been applied, which tells you something about the utility of it. And I guess I'm just offering that as a comment here. Pay close attention, or have somebody pay close attention to the expenditures in science. This one's unique because you've got this huge amount of oil coming out from deep water, offshore, so it deserves something there. Offshore drilling is risky. And there's this concept in systems theory called suboptimization, which the way I understand it is sort of doing in the best possible way something that you should never be doing at all. Right? And so, here, we have a hallelujah from the chorus here. And so, is that what we're doing, with deep water, high pressure, high temperature reservoirs? Probably. And the other thing I think about in this risk analysis business is the most highly engineered system that humans have ever built, the space shuttle. Look at that. We've had about 140 launches. We had the Challenger disaster, whatever, 1986, whatever year that was. And so NASA did a very, very thorough job at mitigating that risk, right? They nailed that one. It was and it also shows how sort of sensitive, very small initial failures can cause catastrophic results. It was the O-ring. It was a little cold on the morning of liftoff. It didn't make a good seal with the fuel tank. The whole thing blew. So they fixed that, and they got that one nailed. What they didn't do, though, is adequately anticipate the failure that happened to the Columbia several years later. That's what we can't. And that was, of course, just a little chunk coming off the gantry on liftoff that took out a little chunk off the wing that caused a catastrophic fire and explosion on re-entry. That's what we can't have happen here. If they go and look at the exact causes of the Deepwater Horizon and fix just those, what about the other 101 ways that this stuff can happen? So that's why you need a comprehensive, holistic view at this kind of thing. We also know that generally oil spill response doesn't really work. In China, on that spill, by the way, it was interesting. The communist government, non-capitalist, right? They paid fishermen based on the amount of oil that they brought in, the number of barrels. They paid them about $40 a barrel. And guess what? their recovery rate was absolutely astonishing. And they brought it, I mean, they recovered tens of thousands of tons. They recovered a heck of a lot of that oil. They were out there putting straw mats out for kilometers offshore and picking it up with chopsticks and spoons and kitchen implements and such like that. Never mind their health impacts, of course, which were pretty traumatic. But at any rate, generally it doesn't work. Water. We've also learned that you can't really restore an oil-injured ecosystem, but you can do better at preventing sources of degradation. And it's really difficult to rehabilitate oiled wildlife. There was some success here in doing it. You have to try, but there's also some issues of disease vectors in rehab centers. We had this in Exxon Valdez, where some of the otters, sea otters that were brought into the rehab centers, contracted a herpes-like virus in the rehab centers because there were not very clinical quarantine procedures. They were then released to the wild and transmitted that virus to the previously unimpacted otter population. So you've got to be really careful. And I know the IBRC guys are pretty good on this, but there are those issues. So we have to be more cautious in policy decisions, where to permit offshore drilling. These two have our attention right now. In the Arctic, which we're very concerned with in Alaska, there's an estimated 20 to 30 billion barrels of oil in the offshore, the OCS of Alaska and the Arctic Ocean, and they are just salivating over that. And very, very irate, as you might expect, with the moratorium. The issue of identifying the high-risk reservoirs and pulling back from them. A company that I have very seldom, if ever, complimented did this, Exxon. In the Gulf of Mexico, there was a field called the Blackbeard Field. They were drilling it, a deep water field, and their engineers said, hey, you know, this does not look good. We don't think we can do this safely. And you know what? They abandoned it. And that's the kind of thing we need to see from industry. But the very troubling thing about all that, they didn't just abandon it. They sold it to a miner operator who now wants to go develop it. And so that's where the government needs to step in and say, now, if an Exxon is abandoning this field because they don't think they can do it safely, shouldn't we pull that off the lease? That's the minimum that should be done. Sure.
After Hurricane Katrina,
Yeah.
our insurance on our homes and everything, and our building codes went up dramatically.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was due to the federal government and the insurance company. Couldn't the same thing be applied to the drilling?
Yeah.
Being that high risk and what have you. I know they are under insurance. All the companies in the Gulf War
Yeah.
increased their insurance rates to make them comply and come into.
That you can. And you know, BP was self-insured, as Exxon was in Alaska. They had external underwriters as well, Lloyd's of London and such. So they had some other insurance markets that were covering them. But the issue of insurance, I think the most important thing, you know, all the money in the world after one of these things can be a palliative in a way, but it doesn't really solve the problem. The interesting thing about insurance is if it's done right, the companies will charge exorbitantly for these high risk, high consequence, or perhaps low probability, high consequence operations, and then they will exercise due diligence in the company's operations to make sure they're doing it with best available technology and best procedures. So if it works right, the insurance company will only insure those things that they think they can adequately mitigate risk for. So, but there's a long discussion about that. I'd be glad to talk with you about that